Welcome back to the studio. Now, in 2019, 4G will become the leading mobile network technology worldwide by number of connections. Meanwhile, early commercial launches for 5G are expected over the next 3 years in North America and in major markets in Asia and Europe. So to put some clarity around early 5G use cases and business models, we've invited some special guests to the studio. We have Mark Giles. Mark is lead analyst at GSMA Intelligence. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Justin.
Also, a familiar face for the studio is Dan Warren, head of 5G research at Samsung UK. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you.
And Stuart Revell, who is external engagement advisor at the 5G Innovation Centre in the UK. Welcome, Stuart.
Thank you.
So, for 5G, gents, it feels like we've been talking about this for about 5 years, I think, but we're finally getting there, I think, slowly. I'm kind of sensing that there's some real momentum at this year's show around 5G. Mark, I'm going to come to you first to hopefully get just a big picture overview of how you see 5G growth developing in the next few years, and especially interested to see how that might compare to previous generations as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, we often hear about the lack of a 5G business model. What are the use cases? But GSMA Intelligence, we see 5G scaling actually quite rapidly. One of the primary drivers is the fact that governments, regulators, and operators are so keen to launch a new generation and to get it out there and to be the first to market. On the other hand, you have the device vendors who are looking to incorporate some new functionality, looking for more reasons to sell units, to return to growth. So the whole industry is kind of waiting for this launch, and the standard acceleration last year at Congress has accelerated that. So at GSMA Intelligence, we see it scaling more rapidly than 4G for enhanced mobile broadband. The enhanced mobile broadband use case, we forecast 1.2 billion 5G connections by 2025. And a lot of that's driven by the fact that there's an awful lot more markets launching earlier on in the 5G tech cycle.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Great overview. We haven't got a huge amount of time, so I'm going to try and get through as much as possible. And I want to focus firstly on some of the benefits that 5G might bring. And I'm going to ask Stuart and Dan to give an overview, but from your company's perspective. So from your background, from Samsung's perspective, Dan, so not starting with the consumer or the enterprise, what benefits does 5G bring to a company like Samsung?
To a company like Samsung, it's a new generation, so there's obviously new revenue associated with that, and also a real impetus back behind research and development within the company as a whole, both on the device side and on the network side. When it comes to new opportunity on sales, the operator intent to access business-to-business opportunities is fundamental. So, whereas previously everything has been around a consumer play with voice, data, increasing data rates, and that's still important for 5G as well. Somewhere down the line, there will be access into new markets, into verticals. The key thing which is missing at the moment is actually all of the, if you like, the underlying ecosystem which enables those verticals to be brought into the market themselves.
Yeah.
And that's partly because of the organisation of those verticals. With the exception of automotive, very few of the other industries have a point of contact similar to GSMA, similar to 3GPP, where you can have a peer relationship to gather requirements.
So is it fair to say that companies like Samsung are not sat there licking their lips at the prospect of huge amounts of operator capex being spent on 5G? It's not going to be a big boom for you?
I think there will be an aspect of boom. Yeah. I mean, particularly if operators are serious about doing things like 100% coverage and 5 nines availability, that's new cell sites, right? That's going to places where you've never been before, and that's not something which technology can solve. That requires capex and investment. So putting a cell in a field is a tough business case to justify, but if you're going to meet the promise, you've got to do that.
So for vendors' perspective, but Stuart, 5G IC, you represent a number of different companies in this space, and you work closely with UK operators, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So the 5G Innovation Centre is actually the largest open innovation centre in the world. And that's deliberate, that's by design, because many research areas are single companies or maybe partnerships. And that's because we believe 5G, with the new use cases and the needs, you have to collaborate much more. I mean, Dan mentioned the verticals. We see 5G as a completely new business, especially with massive communications and ultra reliable. So it's going to address new needs that we actually haven't addressed in mobile before. So critical applications. And having an open innovation centre, we're now at the phase where we've got end-to-end 5G. We've got base stations, we've got user kit, we've got core networks. We're actually looking at how in parallel we develop those. And it's interesting, your numbers actually, kind of the evolution. We see 5G starting right now as, and GSMA calls it 5G era. And I think this is bringing us into a whole new business. And it'd be interesting to see how that evolves. And maybe Samsung's customers of the future are a lot different from what they are now.
Mark, have you done much work into how, if we look at the consumer and the enterprise end user side of things, what kind of services 5G might open up there?
Well, I think on the consumer side, I mean, it's already fairly apparent that market's relatively, tapped out in terms of, consumer spend. New services are going to be immersive entertainment, things that can rely on a high bit rate connection. We saw at the Winter Olympics, there were some examples. There's going to be more, trials will develop over the year. And we'll see more use cases like we're seeing around Congress, around AR in particular. But, this is something when we've talked about the 5G era at GSMA, we really put the emphasis on enterprise. That's the incremental opportunity for operators within the 5G era. But, as the guys have already said, this is it's going to be difficult to capture. It's going to take a long time. There's a lot of other underlying technologies that need to feed into the network to enable that.
Thanks, Mark. We're going to have to take a short break. We've talked about giving a bit of an overview of the market and some of the benefits. I really want to dive into the challenges, though, in the second half of this show. So we're going to take a short break. We'll be back very shortly. Welcome back to the studio. Delighted to be joined again by, we have Mark, Dan and Stuart, and we've spent the first half of this session trying to give a bit of an overview as to the market for 5G and some of the benefits that are out there, but wanted to spend the second half getting a bit down and dirty with the challenges that we might face on the path to 5G. Dan, come to you first. In terms of confusion in the market, I mean, we've got a standard, right? We have a standard that was agreed at the end of last year.
Yep.
But is there still a bit of confusion as to what that actually means? Because standalone versus non-standalone mobile, and then some operators are trying to do mobile, some are starting with fixed wireless access. It doesn't seem to help matters, does it?
No, it doesn't help a great deal. I mean, and I think also some of the messaging around those variants and the steps that can be taken from one to the next is causing confusion as well. The reality is that a lot of the issues that are still being discussed actually relate directly to that discussion. So non-standalone 5G essentially is a new radio attached to the existing 4G core network. As you move to standalone 5G, you have a new core network, which essentially is the old core network but exploded into its most granular functional parts. There is some question about whether a non-standalone and standalone device are actually compatible with each other, whether the radios have any difference, and some of those aspects are still being worked out in 3GPP. The direction seems to suggest that a non-standalone device and a standalone device will actually have the same air interface, or at least be software upgradable from one to the next. So it won't be a situation where things that are bought in the early stages of 5G are essentially cut off from the future evolution. The core network side is a very dynamic space suddenly. So previously, core network clustered functions were done in such a way that they had to be grouped together to enable performance to be met. Now we have softwareization, we have upscale performance of servers, which means that those functional components can actually be spread across the network, and it enables the differentiation between a cloud-based network implementation, a mobile edge-based implementation, and the existence of both of those through network slicing.
Sounds to me, though, with this talk of standalone, non-standalone, Stuart, I mean, are there going to be many operators out there that actually do launch a standalone offering? Because everybody out there today, in terms of operators, obviously has a legacy network, whether it's 3G, 4G, etc. Who's going to go out there and build a whole brand new 5G network from scratch?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, because if you look at the goals of 5G, and I'm going forward in time rather than launching enhanced mobile broadband next year, they are on applications which have not been to consumer and traditional mobile. So you could have networks of networks talking to each other and fresh people coming in, new people coming in, maybe even neutral hosts. So there could be 5G only networks. But actually what's being defined in the standards, I mean 15 was frozen, we got 16 and 17, actually starts orchestrating all sorts of ICT assets. So 5G becomes the centre of a next generation world. So what's happening, although it's confusing, is quite sensible from a business perspective, because nobody throws away the old kit and they have to evolve. It just gets a little bit confusing, and you know, you have to follow the standards very carefully.
And with this confusion, I guess we're going to see new business models come in from operators. I mean, Mark, with the work you're doing with operators, do you see that they're going to have to very much change the way that the business models operate? I mean, I can't see them giving away unlimited data for free in a 5G world. If they're going to make that investment, they've got to get the money back. They've got to generate serious revenue, right?
No, indeed, and you know, making the investment at the first point of call is a challenge in itself, particularly in some markets. I was at a session earlier today over in Hall 8 with Mavenir, where they were talking about the cost of LTE kit, and you know the enterprises will start to look to deploy more LTE kit, maybe even over Wi-Fi going forward. You know, I think you start to see some level of partnership between operators and third parties. We mentioned neutral hosts and things like that. There has to be others. You know, there has to be a change in the business model in terms of deployment, and then you know how the revenue stacks up post that needs to be worked out too. So definitely.
There's also there's a fundamental change in the way that the business operates as well. So business B2C offerings as we stand at the moment, me adding one more device onto a network on the basis of a £20, €20 per month connection is very different to a very large enterprise arriving and wanting to connect 400,000 devices to a network, for example. Not only does 400,000 devices sound like a lot and have a fundamental impact on network capacity across the entire network, it also comes associated with contractual SLAs, comes associated with penalties, liabilities, and the potential to be sued if it all goes wrong. Whereas at the moment, if my service doesn't work, I go outside and press the green button. I might swear under my breath, but I don't go and sue anyone.
And you change operators 2 years down the line.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. We've been developing something called the 5G UK Exchange, and it's a technology interoperability layer essentially, but actually it's a marketplace where people can actually trade across systems and networks, and that's what's going to be required. And when you've got perhaps 1 million things in a very small area, you've got micropayments, you've got all sorts of different new business models that we've got to think about very carefully.
Quick final word, I'll put each of you on the spot if I can, but just a few words from each of you. We're sitting here in 12 months' time. It's February 2019, the next Mobile World Congress. Where would we have got to realistically with 5G? Because there's an awful lot of hype. You know, even yesterday we saw T-Mobile saying they were going to launch in 30 US cities this year. But Stuart, where are we going to be this time next year?
I think you're going to see some things labelled 5G that maybe aren't really 5G launched. I kind of hoping we've moved forward in addressing the massive machine type and ultra reliable critical communications within that year.
Dan?
I think we'll have seen some launches that are labelled 5G. They might not be entirely mobile, and I obviously have one very specific operator in mind. I think we will be starting to see mobile devices, but not very wide scale, not very many actual deployments in terms of operators or indeed subscription uptake.
Final words, Mark?
I think for me, interesting on the use case is more, you know, there's no single use case for 5G. There's a plethora of them, but, you know, going around Congress just now, you see a variety. I think we're going to see more and more, and, you know, I think we just need to move away from that mindset of there needs to be a killer app. 5G, there's going to be many.
Gentlemen, fascinating discussion. Thank you very much. We'll have to do it again next year, 2019. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time for our 5G discussion, but we're going to go over to Sasha, somewhere on the show floor, and she's got the news.